Welcome to Mountains Made Low, where we help you encounter the love of God and live well in the modern world. I'm Christine Reagan.
And I'm Dennis Mueller.
So Dennis, you and I are always discussing and thinking about different topics that might be of interest to our listeners, which is why we love when you send us suggestions of things that you want to hear us talk about. So please keep doing that. It's an enormous help to us to know that we're being helpful to you. And we think that our topic today will be of interest to many people out there because we're going to talk about divorce and annulments. And chances are that if you're in a good relationship, if you're in a good marriage, if you have a solid relationship with your spouse, then you know somebody who has experienced divorce or family members whose marriage has ended in divorce. Maybe you're not going through it yourself. Maybe you are. But this is a topic that I think everybody can relate to, whether you have firsthand experience or you're watching somebody go through it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be helpful to everyone across the board because there's a lot of questions, concerns, and a lot of misunderstandings that are out there regarding divorce within the church and annulments within the church. One of the things that we wanted to establish right here at the outset, before we get into discussing anything, is that we want any listener who may be going through a divorce or who is divorced, we want you to know that you're certainly in our prayers because there's very real pain and suffering that divorce brings to the couple. And that pain and suffering extends into family members, and sometimes it even affects friends.
And I don't know that the church historically has always done a great job ministering to people who are going through divorce.
I wouldn't think that they have the greatest of track records with those things.
And that can cause, that's like more pain upon the suffering that you're already experiencing. It's like, well, where's my church family and all of this?
Right.
Well, Dennis and I are here today. That's what we can't control everything, but we can control what we do.
As we'll come to see in this episode, one of the primary purposes of an annulment in the church is to really serve as an extension of the healing ministry of Jesus and to serve as a balm for the pain and suffering that divorce can often carry. I would doubt that many people, if any, would view or understand annulments in that fashion.
No.
And I think
they look at it as like an administrative process, not as a healing ministry.
Right, but we'll talk more about that and how it kind of connects with the healing ministry in the church and the healing ministry of Christ Jesus as we go through the episode. But
we should probably talk about marriage.
We should probably start with marriage first, make sure everybody's on the same page with everything.
Yeah, because before you can even get into annulments, we have to have a solid understanding of the nature of marriage because it affects the reception of an annulment.
It does, yeah.
We need to understand that to have a marriage annulled is directly related to what the church believes about marriage and the sacramentality of it all as a whole.
So marriage is a permanent bond of love between a man and a woman in which the two literally become one flesh. And the Catholic Church's understanding is that God created marriage to give it to humanity as a basic way of communicating love, his love to the couple and the couple's love to each other and their love for God, and as a means of continuing the human race. And so it's important for us to know that when spouses marry in the Catholic faith, that bond is always presumed to be valid until examined and proven otherwise. So that's the presumption. The churches are going to look at things ahead of time and try to figure out whether it's valid or not. It's just presumed that it is, that the couple's entering into this with their eyes open, that they're ready to make this commitment, that they know what they're getting into. But that's not always the case.
Yeah, if you've gotten to the point where the church you've met with the priest and your wedding has been scheduled, then all of that has been considered. You've had interviews beforehand. It's like, yeah, they think as though it is suitable to marry you based on what you've revealed. Ultimately, that may not have been the case. And that's where annulments come into the conversation. So marriage, being one of the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church, is unique because it's the only sacrament in which the spouses are the ministers of the sacrament themselves. The husband and the wife exchange and confer this upon each other.
Yeah, it's very unique in that way.
In all the other sacraments, it's a member of the clergy, usually a priest, who celebrates the sacrament and then confers God's grace. But the couple does it in marriage, which really makes it stand alone. The priest is only a witness to what's going on. So if both of the spouses are baptized, regardless of their Christian denomination, they give the sacrament to each other. So it really makes marriage stand out from everything else we do in the church.
Yeah. And the Catechism of the Catholic Church states that the sacrament of matrimony is a sacrament of service. And boy, I think a lot of people entering marriage today just either gloss over that or are unaware of that, because each member of the union is really supposed to be a servant of the other, and your love really serves those around you. That's the purpose of marriage.
You know what I thought about before I got married? this is the question I posed to myself. I thought, okay, like Sean and I have been dating for years, and I thought everything's going so well now. We get to go wherever we want. We get to do whatever we want. It's easy to be in love when you don't have any suffering going. And I'm not saying we
Yeah.
didn't have struggles
Sure,
and
sure.
stuff. Of course, everybody has that dynamic. But for the most part, everything was gravy. And then I thought, okay, if Sean were to get in some kind of terrible accident and I had to nurse him for the rest of my life as a young wife, would I do that? And I was like, absolutely. And I thought it would be an honor to do that. And that's when I thought, yeah, if I'm willing to serve him in that way now, right? If something were to happen the day after we got married, then I'm like, yeah, I'm ready to serve. I'm ready. I
Good.
would grow into an understanding of what that was, but that was a big deal to me, that it's not just like, oh, am I going to love him when things are good and we're free and we're young? And I thought, no, I need to love him in any circumstance. So I tried to go to the worst possible thing, and I thought I would still do it, and it
Yeah.
would be an honor to do it.
And I think that's one of the reasons why we as a church see this as a good thing for the world. Marriage is a good thing for the world. Matrimony really gives the spouses the grace that they need to love each other with the love that Christ loves his church, that sacrificial love. I love it, when they get into, I forget where it's at in Paul, I don't know if it's in Corinthians or Philippians, but when they get into that whole wives, be obedient to your husbands, and the husbands are sitting there nudging their
Yeah.
wives, during mass,
Yeah.
like, are you listening to this? Are you listening to this? But how quickly the guys kind of gloss over the second part of that when Paul says, husbands, love your wives with the same love that Christ had for his church.
Yeah.
What did Christ do for the church? He died for the church.
Right.
And I just heard a presentation just over the weekend where that's one of the reasons why the groom wears black at a wedding.
Really?
Because and again, some people might say, oh, this is just so sexist, but it's the man's responsibility to die unto himself for love of his bride, just as Christ did. And that's one of the reasons why he wears black. And that's not to say that the wife or a woman can't do that. They
Sure,
do.
there's always mutual
They
sacrifice.
they do
Always.
that.
Do you know why the woman wears white?
Well, I mean, it's purity and innocence. Is there more to it than that? Or
Well, it just historically, Queen Victoria was the first one to do that.
she was an
The
influencer
meaning,
even back then.
she was. It fits the meaning of marriage, certainly, but she was the first one to wear white.
Right.
And so it's like, oh, Queen Victoria's doing it? Sure, let's do
Then
it.
everybody does
Yeah.
it. Trendsetter. Yeah.
I remember when my husband and I used to do marriage prep, because you're talking about how you need the grace of the sacrament.
Oh,
The
yeah.
sacrament gives you something that you need within that relationship. And I remember when my husband and I used to do marriage prep for the couples in the Archdiocese, I used to get real serious and I used to say, do you think you have the ability to love the person next to you all on your own? And I would just say, you don't. And I knew that they didn't because I didn't.
Right.
And, you think that, oh, no, of course I'm going to love this person as they deserve to be loved, but you don't have the ability to do that.
Yeah.
But you're like, but you want that for them. Well, if you want that for them, then God has to help you do it.
Yeah.
Because just look at every other area of your life where you have failed to love. Well, that's why you need marriage as a sacrament, because God fortifies you to be able to love that person who you love more than anything in the world in the way that he loves them. You do that for them, they do that for you, but you can't do this all on your own, and you're not meant to.
You're not meant to. That's
So
right.
it's a ton of pressure for a young couple being like, man, I got to love this person for the rest of my life. God helps you do it. That's why you need the sacrament of marriage.
I know God helps my wife. I don't know how she does it.
I know that God also helps your wife. I also know that. Because it's a divine thing that's going on in marriage. There's something probably also at your house. So there you go.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. But it's for this reason that the church really believes strongly in the sanctity of marriage and its permanency because of all these things. I mean, let's face reality. What happens when one or both spouses are not serving each other or working for the good of the other? Sometimes, if the underlying issues can't be resolved or can't be worked through by the spouses, then the spouses end up divorcing. But because the marriage bond is sealed by God Himself, it is by its very nature indissoluble and irrevocable. It cannot be destroyed and it cannot be changed or reversed. This is the premise that the church is operating from.
Because that's how God created it in the first
Right.
place. Go back to Adam and Eve. Where did God create marriage? In the beginning.
So even though a couple may be legally divorced in the eyes of the state and the civil authorities, the church still considers the marriage bond, the sacramental bond between the spouses, to be intact.
And And that's the part that I think is really difficult for people to hear. It's like,
Right.
even if you're divorced, you're still sacramentally married.
Yeah. And so the couple is still married, even though they have this legal document saying that they are divorced. And so as a Catholic, it's important for us to understand that divorce has no impact whatsoever on your right to receive communion, to go to confession, to receive anointing of the sick, or to go to Mass and worship. You can still continue to do those things as a divorced individual. Your standing in the church doesn't change, and you do not lose any of those rights that we just talked about as a Catholic,
Like your rights to the
your
sacraments.
rights to the sacraments, except the right to enter into a new marriage. Because, again, that previous sacramental bond is permanent. It's still intact.
There's nothing even previous about it. It's like the original bond that you
Yeah, that's true.
formed. It's
That's a
like
better,
it's
yeah.
never not been since you entered into it. So you don't lose any of your sacramental rights. The only thing that would prevent you from receiving a sacrament is if you're in a serious state of mortal sin. If you were to remarry outside of the church, right, you're still sacramentally considered to be married, but now you're going outside of the church and you're marrying another spouse civilly, well, then you're cohabitating with that partner.
Right.
Then you would be considered to be objectively in a serious state of sin because your prior bond still is a reality.
Yeah, and Jesus is very explicit when it comes to the permanency of marriage. I mean, he says right there in the gospel, I think it's Mark in chapter 10, what God has joined, no human being must separate.
And that's
Right.
what civil authorities seek to do in divorce. And you can do that in a civil way, but the civil declaration has no bearing on the sacramental validity. So, having said that, saying that, yes, you can be divorced. Sometimes there's a reason to be divorced. You don't lose any of your rights in the Catholic faith, and you're standing in having a divorced status. But divorce is also really serious, and it shouldn't be taken lightly. Yes, under certain circumstances, it can be an option and maybe even should be an option, especially if there's abuse involved.
Absolutely, yep.
There is no discussion about any of
Right,
that.
there's
okay?
a need, yep.
But the church, if you go to the teaching that is contained in the catechism, the church speaks very clearly about how divorce is generally not a good thing and that it's very, very damaging. But the catechism specifically says how it introduces disorder into the family and in society. And I think people who are divorced and they've kind of seen, even if it was a legitimate circumstance to obtain a divorce, they'll tell you kind of the havoc that it wreaked on their family.
Right.
Now,
And continues.
maybe that's the lesser of two evils too.
Yeah.
It's not a benign thing. It's not a benign reality. It can leave a spouse deserted, especially a spouse who did not desire this. It can traumatize children. And I have seen it have this contagious effect in society and in families. And I just think it's unfortunate that we look at it as no big deal because so many people are divorced and so many people come from divorce. But even if it is justified, you don't come out of it unscathed. It really should be your last resort.
Yeah.
I heard this thing last night. Like, so many things can replace God in our life.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to have your romantic partner or your spouse become God in your life. And somebody pointed out that when you think you might even like identify your husband or your wife as the one. Like a way in which we should really only be addressing God. And we know what we mean when we say that.
Right.
But it's like you put so much pressure on that person to be everything for you, to be your best friend, to be your lover, to be your inspiration, to be your consolation and your escape and everything. Though you can't possibly meet those expectations. So when you fall short, well, it's very easy to just say, well, you've let me down or this relationship has let me down. Because we've really built them in to be God and they can't be God.
Yeah.
And we can't be divine for them. So it's just this role confusion. Once that person in the interview said, we even call our spouses the one. Oh, I found the one. It's like, maybe
Well,
that's problematic.
I don't know. But public apology to my wife, Denise, right now for for putting all that pressure on her.
But do you get my point though?
I do.
We're like,
I never really looked at it that way.
I think that's why it's so easy for people to get divorced. Because when our expectations, which might be too high, are not met, it's like, well, I'm just going to get out of this because you're not being who I thought you were supposed to be for me.
Yeah, that
And
I
I
can
think
see.
that's
I can see
what I'm
that.
getting
Yeah.
at. Yeah.
When it comes to annulments, like how do annulments factor into all of this stuff? If this is the church's understanding of marriage and its permanency, and this is the church's view of divorce, then what is the deal with annulments in the church? And I think for a lot of us, the first hurdle that we run into with annulments is this question of how can the church even grant an annulment if God joined this couple and if marriage is really sacred and permanent as it teaches?
Yeah, it seems like a contradiction.
Yeah.
And it would be if annulments were just like this administrative process or like a Catholic version of divorce, but they're not. The purpose of an annulment is to determine whether God truly joined the spouses together on the day that their vows were exchanged, on the day of their wedding, when the sacramental bond was presumed to have taken place.
So
So it looks at the relationship at that point and before. Certainly, it'll kind of talk about what happened afterwards, because most likely what occurred after the marriage probably
is
started long before.
there was a pattern there. So we have to remember that the church always presumes, like we said at the beginning, the validity of the marital bond between the baptized man and the baptized woman. But sometimes there are things that can affect the validity of that union. And if after proper investigation the church finds that indeed to be the case, that's the annulment process, then the marriage was null and the sacramental bond never took place. So the end result is that the church makes this official declaration of nullity,
Which is a way better term than I think than annulment. I
Right.
think annulment looks like, well, I got this from the church. It's like, no, the church is making a statement
Yeah.
about something that happened in historical time.
Right.
That's different.
We call it an annulment, but the church's official term it's a declaration of nullity.
It's just
And
making a pronouncement about what happened.
it's just making
Yeah.
a pronouncement. It's making an official pronouncement that the sacramental bond didn't take place. And they do that after they conclude their investigation, and then when that is issued, the couple is free to remarry because the sacramental bond never occurred. And this is really an important distinction, because an annulment does not nullify the marriage. The marriage took place, there were witnesses, there's a legal document, there's videos and photos proving that the marriage took place, there's a civil record of that marriage taking place. It's for this very same reason that the annulment process has no bearing whatsoever on the status of children. All the annulment is saying is that the sacrament never took place. So you were certainly legally married at the time. Your children are legitimate. So getting an annulment has no impact or bearing on the legitimacy of children. And that's an important one because that question comes up a lot. So an annulment only deals with the sacramental bond, that which makes the marriage permanent and indissoluble. If the bond didn't take place because of some defect on that day, because
An obstacle that previously existed. Yeah.
then the sacrament did not take place and the couple's free to remarry.
Because contractual bonds can be broken. The out clauses are built into the wording of the contract itself. There are some crazy contracts out there today. Just look into like celebrity prenuptial agreements or postnuptial agreements. I mean,
Right.
there are all sorts of things building into a contract. Like, this is how we're going to get out of it. In the context of a marriage.
Yeah.
Like, that's just, there should be no occasion for that.
So you can see that if you're entering into marriage with an eye towards an exit strategy, that there's a problem with the sacramental bond from the get-go. It's right there. I mean, if you're doing like a prenuptial agreement, well then there's cause for concern from the get-go.
I was watching an interview one time with one of my favorite opera singers. He had been married for a long time, and like 50 years or something. And the interviewer said, like, oh, you and your wife have been married for so long. Did you ever think about divorce? Have things ever been hard? He was like, no, I've never thought about divorce. Murder, yes. Divorce, no.
Not. I remember that. I forget who that was, but I remember
I'm sure a
that.
million people have said that, but
Yeah,
I heard
yeah.
it from this guy. And I just thought it was hilarious.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like, no, we don't even say that word in this house.
Right.
We don't even
We talk
about
murder
it.
all the time. And again, what we're talking about here is that while a contractual bond can be broken, again, this license that we have to marry, right? We can have that license revoked and through divorce. Sacramental bonds, no. A sacramental bond cannot, and I'll say it again, cannot be broken. And so it's important to understand too that when we talk about annulments, what the annulment process does, the church isn't breaking that sacramental bond in the annulment process. What the church is saying is the sacramental bond never took place in the first place.
So there's nothing to break.
So there's nothing to
Yeah.
break, right? They're not breaking. So don't think like divorce is breaking the marriage, right?
Right.
It's there's separation and divorce. There's a separation there, a legal separation. That's not what happens in an annulment process. If Jesus says, what God has brought together, no man can render asunder. Well, even the church does not have the authority to render asunder something. But what they're doing it through the annulment process is saying that the sacramental bond never took place in the first place.
That's important too. Like the church is only in the business of doing the things that Jesus said that she could do.
Yep.
End of story.
So it really has everything to do with what makes a sacrament to be conferred in the first place. So every sacrament, it's important to note that every sacrament involves two things: form and matter. What is the form? The form of the words that's used in the exchange of the sacrament. The matter is the stuff. It's the elements that are used in the sacrament. So for example, the form for the sacrament of baptism, the words are, Dennis, I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And the matter is the water and the unbaptized individual. I mean, you need somebody there to baptize, right?
Yeah.
The person
That
themselves,
one's kind of forgotten about. Where are you going to put the water?
the person being baptized is the element. They are the matter, and so is the water that's being poured over their head. To understand what affects the validity of all this, if the priest or the deacon uses oil to baptize,
And oil is used in baptism, but it's not part.
it's not poured over.
additional.
And if they were to say the words like, in the name of the Creator, the Redeemer, and the Sanctifier, instead of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, the sacrament does not occur. It didn't happen. You might have been there, you might have witnessed a lot of stuff, but the sacrament itself didn't happen. And that's what happens in the sacrament of matrimony when they do this investigation.
I always explain it like a sacramental equation: 2 + 2 = 4. Well, you need these words with this stuff, and what's the result? Divine life, union
Right.
with God. Marriage has its own matter and form too. So the form for marriage would be the I do that's given in response to the vows. And then the matter for marriage is the mutual free consent, the desire to live together, and then the consummation of that marriage.
It's usually in the elements of the sacrament of marriage that we run into issues when it comes to, or we found grounds for nullity in the annulment process. A couple that never consummated their marriage, or who never lived together, or clear-cut cases for determining that the bond never existed.
So that happened historically when Catherine of Aragon married Henry VIII. She was originally married to his brother. Mm-hmm. She claimed that the marriage was never consummated, and so she was free to marry Henry. Right. And then later he tried to imprison her by saying, oh no, she consummated that marriage when she, to her dying day, said, I never consummated. So that's why she believed I was validly married to Henry.
Right.
And that's why she wouldn't give him an annulment.
Yeah.
Or she wouldn't participate in the annulment that he
annulment
never
process.
ultimately got from the Pope.
Right.
So
to determine if there's an issue with the matter in the sacrament, where there's an issue with the mutual free consent, the desire to live together, the desire, to consummate the marriage.
People are the matter themselves.
The people are the matter themselves, right? Then it takes a little bit of investigating to see whether there really was mutual consent, whether that consent was given freely, and whether there really was a desire to live out these vows together. So some of the questions that are asked in an annulment process during this investigation is they want to see if there was pressure to get married.
Have you come here freely and without reservation?
Right.
Yeah.
That's one of the questions that's asked of the marriage. And so this idea of like a shotgun wedding, well, that would render grounds for an annulment. And again, like we think of shotgun weddings, typically like the movies and the jokes where, where the dad's standing there, with a rifle in hand saying, you're going to marry my daughter. But just think about how many times in a relationship, especially where a relationship where there's commitment issues, where one of the couples says to the other, if you don't marry me, I'm going to leave you.
I'm going to leave you. Yeah.
I'm out.
I put my time in. Come on.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're not going to put a ring on my finger, then I'm leaving you. There's pressure there to get married.
There could be pressure.
Could be pressure.
There could
be pressure, right? So again, all of this stuff, this is what the annulment process does. They take a look to see whether there was any type of an impediment to what took place there, and that affects the sacramental bond. Pregnancy out of wedlock sometimes can be...
It can feel like that pressure.
Yeah,
right.
can be an outside pressure to get married, even though you know that this guy or this girl might not be the best for you. I mean, it's a contentious relationship, and...
Yeah, somebody might not feel free, right?
Yeah.
Do you come here freely? Well, actually, the baby that we're having is kind of making me feel very tied to this, right?
Right.
It's the baby is a wonderful gift. That's a separate thing.
Yeah.
But it can't take away your freedom. It can't influence your freedom to enter into the marriage.
Yeah. Some other things that they might look at too were the question of whether both parties were mature enough to understand the nature of marriage. And this doesn't just deal with age. This isn't just an age thing, were they old enough to really understand, but even mentally and emotionally mature too. I mean, I can't tell you how many guys I know that are immature with regards to being emotionally immature.
I have a great statistic on that. Keep talking. Go ahead.
Okay. But you also have to exercise care with someone who might be cognitively challenged, somebody who might have some type of a cognitive disability. If they're getting married, and the church wouldn't prohibit them from getting married for sure, but you want to ensure that they fully understand what it is that they are entering into.
So this is why age doesn't necessarily come with the maturity that's needed in marriage. They say in the US, 50%, around 50% of all first marriages fail. 67% of all second marriages fail, and then 73 of all third marriages end in divorce.
Wow.
So you're not necessarily getting better with age, right? There's other factors that are influencing
Right.
why.
Maybe it's you.
Maybe.
Some other things too, like did both parties know each other well enough and long enough to make that type of a commitment? Meeting somebody and falling head over heels and getting married in Las Vegas in a week.
Did they really know each other enough that they could even make
that
a
decision,
statement
a
of
knowing
freedom?
Decision? Yeah.
How about a prenup being signed? Right?
Right.
And a prenup is a tricky conversation because there are some kinds of prenuptial agreements that don't invalidate, that are not an impediment to a sacramental marriage, but many are. So again, if you have like a cheating clause or something in your prenuptial agreement, then yes, that would invalidate the marriage, right? So,
What would be? Can you give an example of what?
like a prenup that would be okay.
Yeah.
And this is an example that I have heard of. If you are entering into your two spouses previously married, both of the first spouses die, they're free to marry each other.
Mm-hmm.
There are kids involved, there's money involved, there's inheritance rights involved.
I gotcha.
That can be worked out in previously existing contracts, and that does not invalidate the sacramental bond.
Okay.
Yeah.
I hadn't
So
heard
if-
that before though.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
And that
It's a
doesn't.
thing.
It really doesn't have any effect on the sacramental bond.
It's going to have to be examined by each, on a case by case basis.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about, assets and inheritances that may be tied to children of a previous spouse or just property rights,
Okay.
that doesn't impact the promises that you're making to each other.
Okay.
That doesn't impact the permanency of the bond, the openness to children, perhaps. Frankly, if you're marrying for a second time, you might not even be in a place where you can biologically have children anymore.
Sure.
And in that case, that part of the vow can be omitted entirely.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah. So not all prenups are out and out rejected, but I would imagine that in the way that we think of them, right? I will love you until this happens.
Yeah.
That would
be-
violate the nature
yeah,
of the
I get that. Yeah.
the nature of the sacrament. You talked about like cognitive development. Psychological stability also has to be investigated too and looked into because maybe that can affect the commitment that a couple is making in marriage. Was their decision impacted by addictive behavior, something like that? And also deception. Did you really reveal yourself fully to the other person so that they can accept you and marry you fully? Or are you trying to pull the wool over their eyes? Are you trying to deceive them about who you are and your personality and your past? You have to really be entirely vulnerable with this person.
Open and honest. And
Yeah.
True.
So you don't ever desire to have children, but you never told the other person that you're not interested in children. If you haven't shared that with your spouse and now they're entering into marriage, desiring to have children and to be open to life with you, that's deception on your part.
And I would probably say the more frequent case would probably be like if Denise were to ask me that question and we're dialoguing about it and I'm telling her I do.
Right, but you don't.
But I don't. But like I'm telling her what she wants to hear so we can get married. And then when we get married, I'm like, well, she'll accept my point of view once we get married, and then it doesn't happen.
I can change her, she can change me.
Right.
Yeah. Also, if you never plan on, even if two spouses were to be open with each other and say, "Listen, I'm not interested in ever having children. It is just a non-negotiable for me," and the other spouse says, "Well, yeah, I don't want to have children either. We're going to enter into marriage, and we are never going to be open to having children." you cannot be married in the Catholic faith. You cannot receive a sacramental marriage.
Yeah, because one of the vows that you're making is to be open to the possibility of children. And if both of you are going into that sacramental marriage with the idea that, well, you're not going to fulfill that vow, you have no intention to fulfill that vow.
But we're going to contracept the entirety of our marriage.
Yeah, then the sacramental bond does not happen. The bond doesn't happen in that case.
Yeah, that would be a pretty serious impediment to marriage. If you have a secret family in Canada, also an impediment to marriage. You cannot be validly married. You can't marry somebody for their money. So I mean, there's a long list of things, right? There's one of the impediments is you can't kidnap your spouse. It's
Right.
like when you look at the list of things that would be an obstacle to entering into a marriage, you have to remember that historically there's a reason that these things ended up as having to be listed in the catechism of no, can't do this, because I would imagine as the church encountered that this had happened, this had happened.
Apparently kidnapping of the bride was pretty frequent at some point.
Oh my gosh.
But it's clear that we'd probably look at any marriage that has these type of circumstances in it as being unhealthy and certainly not directed towards the good of the other. The case would go before the marriage tribunal of the diocese, and what they would do is they would investigate the case. They would go through all of these questions, try to make a determination. Was there something that compromised the validity of the sacramental bond at the time of the marriage? And if they determine that, yes, there was, then they make that declaration of nullity, stating that the sacramental bond never occurred. It didn't happen. And now the couple is free to remarry whomever they wish.
How about some statistics for you? Some annulment statistics.
Wouldn't be you without statistics.
I love my books and my numbers. So the United States has the highest rates of annulments in the entire universe.
Pretty close.
Well, yeah, probably. I don't know what they're doing on Mars, but yeah.
Right.
The United States has the highest rate of annulments in the entire global church, and about 80% of all annulments that are requested are granted.
Here in the United States? Or is that global?
Yes, the United States.
Okay.
Yes. They say about tens of thousands of annulments are brought forth each year from around the world, and nearly half of them, this is the statistic that I think really stands out, half of them are from the U.S. So we have a marriage problem. So, I mean, what's going on in this country that couples who marry from here are seeking annulments and receiving annulments more than anybody else in the world? Are we giving children, as they're growing up, good examples of marriage? That's going to affect them too. Does the church really teach about what marriage is and how it's meant to be lived out? You know what marriage prep is in this country? An 8-hour day in a parish where you sit and couples talk at you about their marriage. And I know because I've been one of those couples talking at the couples.
Me too.
And that's going to get them through the next 50, 60 years.
Yeah.
Really? Best case scenario, you meet for 6 Tuesdays in a row.
Especially when society is certainly feeding you a completely different image of marriage. So I'm not surprised by those statistics, but at the same time, they're a little unsettling for me. Mm-hmm. At least as somebody who has kids who are coming up in this culture, who may be getting married at some point in their lives. The cards would be, on paper at least, stacked against them. Now, I would hope that...
And if you have 4 kids, the statistics are that half of them will be divorced. So I'm certainly not saying that that's what would happen.
Thanks for the encouragement.
But that's no, statistically speaking, if somebody looked at, we're 2 people in a room right now, one of us should be divorced, but we're not. So why aren't we? Right? There's something else going on. And hopefully we're transmitting that to our kids.
That's what I'm hoping too. With regards to the formation that they received. It's important. And things can kind of get tough, especially if we are families that have experienced divorce.
Right.
It's tough for us to sometimes maybe break that cycle because, like you said, there's a contagion. There's a pattern of behavior that kind of begins or could begin to develop.
We'll have to have an episode on marriage. We're trying to get the spouses in. That's what we're trying to do.
We're trying.
Maybe one day it'll happen.
Yeah, one of those spouses is a little resistant, but we won't name names now.
No. I don't know that the other spouse is that much more cooperative, but we could make it happen.
We could.
We're
working on it. We're working on it.
But marriage is good. Marriage is good. It's good for the spouses. It's good for children. It's good for the world. It's a vocation that directs those people towards heaven in a way that is so specific to them, their personality, their state in life, what God has in store for them. So if you think about what somebody receives after they get their annulment, after they receive that declaration of nullity, if somebody is indeed free to marry, then they can be open to God's will in this area and perhaps marry again, really for the first time in a sacramental way, or not.
It's a shame that so many view annulments just as some type of an administrative formality in the Catholic Church.
It can
But
really leave a bad taste in people's mouths.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it
And
really can.
and here's the other thing too. One of the criticisms, and we didn't talk about this, but one of the criticisms of the Catholic Church is that this is a cash grab for them. They're looking to make money off of this. Back in the day, prior to 2016, the fee to have an annulment was probably set around $800, and that was probably universal across the diocese, at least here in the United States, I would suspect. But that fee covered purely the administrative costs.
Yeah, people work in these offices. They make a living
Yeah, it's
working for the church too.
right. So
They have
that
to
was
be paid.
administrative costs. But as of 2016, so we're talking 9 years now. 9 years now, the Catholic Church universally across the world has not been charging for annulments. And that was one of the good things to come out of the World Meeting of Families in 2015 with Pope Francis here in the United States and everything that was focused on families that year. All of the things that have kind of issued since then. To say that, I'm not getting an annulment because it's just a money-making thing for the church. I just want to go on record now saying that is a moot point because the Catholic Church does not charge
There's no money
anything. There's
that
no money,
exchanges
no
hands.
money exchanging hands now for annulments. So there's really no reason why. And the other thing here too is some people are afraid to get annulments because sometimes their former spouse, sometimes it's so contentious that they're afraid to bring them into the process, or they're afraid that they're going to say no. They're going to refuse to cooperate. You don't need the cooperation of the other spouse. So when you bring your petition before the marriage tribunal, they do all that investigation, and yes, they'll send your spouse,
They have
provided
to be notified.
right, they'll be notified and they'll be asked to provide some information. But if they refuse or if they can't be found, sometimes that's it. There's a separation there and good riddance. You have no idea. You have no
Secret family
contact.
in Canada.
Yeah,
You can't find them.
back to their secret family in Canada. That's not going to impede the process if they don't return it. They're just going to work with the information that's provided, that you provide, that other witnesses provide, and they'll do a thorough investigation of all that to determine whether the sacramental bond took place.
In a pretty timely manner, too.
Yeah, it doesn't
they do try
take long.
to expedite this.
Sometimes the cases are pretty clear cut. Declaration can be declared a little quicker, but every case is unique. I think one of the most important things that we talked about at the very beginning as we wrap things up here, annulments really are an extension of the healing of Christ and his church. And we know that civil divorce can cause many wounds, and an annulment seeks to enter into that. It's the way in which Jesus meets us specifically in our pain. So if you think about it, like many who seek annulments have suffered gravely because of a spouse who did not understand marriage or approach marriage in a way that was immoral or improper, total misunderstanding about what marriage should be and what their obligations and expectations as a spouse, their role in that marriage was. Part of the healing process is understanding what occurred so that you can move forward acknowledging the truth of what took place in that relationship, so it's not carried as a burden of confusion, regret, or negative emotion.
Yeah.
That's
There's enough of that going on.
That's where the healing can kind of come in. And sometimes if marriage is truly understood by the church, and this is truth, I mean, I believe this, that marriage is something that God not only created, but that God calls us to. If it has its origin in God, and God called this couple together, if we, through the investigation process, through the annulment process, the church determines that no, that wasn't the case. This couple was not called together by God. There was no sacramental bond here. Then there's a little bit of a sigh of relief too.
Yeah.
Because I realize, this, God didn't mean for us to be together.
Yeah.
And
it
again,
can be a burden that you're just holding, and
Yeah.
the annulment process can help you lay down the burden.
yeah, and I think that can bring a sense of healing. as well.
On that theme, I wanted to read this to you. This is from an article that I read. You can read it on Femme Catholic. The author is Patty Breen, and the title of the article is "An Annulment Isn't Catholic Divorce. I Know Because I Got One." Okay. And she says this. She said, "You can't heal from pain unless you see where you need to learn and grow. This process allows you to see your life, relationship, and marriage with a clearer perspective. As I went through my own annulment, I started to believe that this process exists in the church out of the great mercy of Jesus.
There you have it.
Why? Because wherever one of his children is suffering, that matters deeply to the heart of God. The annulment process is a way through which Jesus wants to bind up the wounds of divorced people. It's not just a set of logistical hoops to jump through. It's an avenue to personal healing with the grace and friendship of Jesus accompanying you every step of the way."
That's well said.
It really, I even tried to paraphrase that so many times, and I'm like, nope, we're going to read it
Yeah.
flat out.
Yeah.
Annulments can lead to the emotional healing that has to take place. God wants you to move forward. God wants you to have the closure that you desperately desire. And annulments can allow for periods of self-reflection, for prayer, for spiritual support, maybe counseling. And the people who are interacting with you from the church, some of the ministers, some of the professionals, they can support you. They can be the personal context that you need.
And like you said
help
earlier,
you.
that's how it acts as that bomb, right? Because it
Yeah.
gets into the womb. It seeps right into the
Right.
womb.
It is the
if it takes place.
hydrocortisone of, I don't know. No, what's that typical
Triple antibiotic ointment.
Yeah. I don't know what that is.
Yeah.
But yeah, you want to get it in there. Jesus wants to get in there and heal you from the inside out, right? And it's
Right.
not as though the church is just, oh, it's not sacramental. Just say it's not so we can move on. No. Because what I love about the annulment process is that because your marriage is presumed to be valid, that's an important ingredient because marriage deserves that.
Yeah.
Marriage deserves to be understood as it may have been entered into. The annulment process examines the relationship head on, and in doing that, the church tribunal is giving the marriage the respect that it deserves. If the church doesn't care about the annulment process, then it also means that it didn't care about your marriage in the first place. And so give marriage its due as God is ministering to you, as the church is ministering to you and bringing about healing. By the way, that healing can take place whether your sacramental bond is found to be existing or not existing.
Yeah.
The healing of Christ still applies. Right? You want to know that you have a future of hope, and that's biblical. Father Pavanka says this. Father Dave, I think he's from Steubenville. He says that peace isn't the absence of something. It's a grace that enters into your life, into the challenges. So you don't have to wait to not have any more problems to have the peace of Christ in your
Right.
life. So often when things don't go how we wanted them to or how we thought they would, we just kind of wish them away and we don't acknowledge them. And then we maybe don't process it at all. But peace isn't the absence of the pain that we're experiencing, sadness that we're feeling. The annulment process allows for the processing of everything, not to make it sound so formulaic, but it allows for us to understand the marital bond in whatever way is appropriate to your relationship. And then peace and healing can flow from the truth of the matter. That's what the annulment's trying to get to.
Right.
What's the truth of what occurred? And God always speaks to us in truth, and he can always heal us through the truth.
Yeah.
So we can have the peace of Christ in the suffering because it's not an easy process.
No.
It may be difficult at times. He's with us. His peace is with us in the difficult times too.
We hope that this clears up some of the misperceptions about what an annulment is and isn't, and also provide some education on the topic for those of us who are both married and divorced. If you are divorced in the church and you have remarried without an annulment, I would ask you to give some serious prayerful consideration to getting your current marriage right within the church by getting that first marriage or second marriage annulled. Go through the
We're
process.
seeking the annulment because
Right.
here's the thing: we don't know what will happen.
We don't.
We don't know what will be
again,
determined.
there's no guarantee, but
But
odds
80% also go through.
are in your favor here in the United States that you will receive the annulment because there is some type of deficiency in in the form or the matter of the sacrament. So I would encourage you, if you find yourself in that type of a situation, to give serious prayer to that.
Talk to your parish priest.
You have nothing to lose because there's no financial cost to you. It is going to cost you some time, and maybe you have to dredge up some emotional wounds. But sometimes when you do that's where the healing can kind of come in at. And if you're healing from that wound from the first marriage, that's just going to make you healthier for your second.
Right.
So it's a win-win. So just prayerfully consider doing that. And if you know somebody who is divorced and they're looking to remarry, or they're interested in seeing somebody and rekindling a relationship with somebody, give them the information about annulments. Answer some of the questions, direct them to somebody so they can get them that information, because it's going to be most helpful to them too.
Yeah. You want them to grow in the sacramental life of the church.
Absolutely.
They need the sacraments for their life.
Yeah.
So, all right, reach out to us. Please let us know what you want us to talk about, different topics that we can bring to future episodes. You can email us at mmlpodcast@outlook.com. Remember to like our episodes, subscribe, comment. It all helps the algorithms in getting this ministry out to other people.
Yeah.
And we will see you next week.
Yeah, God bless. I'm really happy that this episode is over, because I have been distracted the entire time by the writing on your hand, on the top of your hand, because it's upside down and I can't read it, and you're waving your hands around as you talk, and I have been trying to make out what that says.
So I remember that I have a meeting tonight, and I know that there's not a reminder in my phone.
So you put the reminder on your hand.
So
it's perfect.
as it was the easiest thing to respect the fact that you're still talking, and I really cannot forget about this. I don't think I've written on my hand since I was like in high school.
I saw that. I'm like, what is going on here? We are devolving as professionals.
No, I am thinking, you know what? Sometimes the old tricks work the best.
That's
right?
true.
This will be
That's
here
true.
for 5 days.
Because it's not going to wash
it's
off.
It's a pretty heavy pen, but I can't forget about my meeting.
All right. God bless.
That's being responsible.
That is.
Dennis.
Well, you can call it what you want. God
Good night,
bless.
everybody.